In the name of Christ, amen. Please be seated. Our readings are so chock full. I hope you brought lunch. Right? Everybody's ready for a good long sermon here. We're going to have to skip over a little of this, I'm afraid. But I want to look at sort of a broad topic that comes out of this reading from Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans, and then from the Gospel of Matthew, because they are related. And I think that it has a lot to do, not with great theological themes necessarily, but in just good mental health. Good mental health. This reading from Romans is really focused on what was going on among followers of the way in Paul's time. Remember, there were no Christians yet. It was still within the synagogues that the followers of the way of Christ were still almost entirely located. And it was a movement within Judaism. But within those synagogues, there were those who were not ethnically Jewish, who had been Gentiles, had probably been polytheists, who were worshiping, or not, the various Greek and Roman gods. But they had been drawn to Judaism because of what they saw both in their worship, but also in their faith communities. They saw that there was a certain integrity, there was strength, there was something that attracted them to these synagogues. And those were the people that Paul primarily targeted with his evangelism. In the process, he's telling them, by following the way of Christ, you can circumvent, if you so desire, eating kosher, circumcision, all these Jewish practices that were an obstacle to many of these Gentiles. That being said, what, as you can imagine, is happening in these synagogues is great controversy is arising. Because people are messing with ancient traditions. So he is saying in this letter to the Romans, before he gets to Rome, that inviting people in is going to bring a whole new dynamic into the synagogue. And we have to recognize that we don't bring these folks in to quarrel with them. What's the point of that? But we also have to be willing to accept the practices, the spiritual practices of different people. He's talking in here about those who honor the one day. Of course, we're talking about the Sabbath. But then these Gentiles, there was no Sabbath for the Gentiles. He's saying to these folks in Rome, whatever people do as an expression of their relationship with God needs to be respected. That it's not up to us to judge one another on the appropriateness of those things, the validity of their practices, but just give them the benefit of the doubt. If they're doing it for God, that needs to be good enough for us. Well, if the church would have followed that, say for the next, approaching 2,000 years, we would have been a lot better off. Because if you look at the history of Christianity, the real high points, well, let's see, we could start with 1054 with the big split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And then there was the Reformation. And how many times has the Episcopal Church divided off and created new denominations? At least every time we created a new prayer book. We have divided against ourselves over and over and over again, and sometimes with great enmity. Sometimes the 100 Years' War was really the War of the Reformation, when Christians went after each other with mace and crude guns and cannons. They killed each other off. Or think of the Inquisition. The horrible things that Christians did to one another over the Inquisition. So, holding on with a death grip to what we as an individual or as a faith community understands as how we're going to express our walk with Christ needs to be held not like this, but like this. With an open hand. An open hand. So that we don't fall into taking that iron grip and using it like a fist. It's not a sign of deep faith to be rigid and judgmental. That doesn't make you in a better relationship with God. If we listen to the teachings of Jesus, he always seems to be saying, go lightly. Hold what you have in an open hand. Respect one another. Forgive one another. And here's the segue into the gospel about forgiveness. It's the same sort of principle. It's that holding on to a perceived injury that creates most of the problems of the world. Think of the Hatfields and the McCoys. That's become kind of an American icon. And we joke about the Hatfields and McCoys, but, you know, it's not so far from the way we are. You know, the Hatfields and the McCoys, two warring clans in Appalachia. I think it might have had something to do with one of the Hatfields marrying a McCoy. They didn't like it, and the families went out. I don't even remember. They probably didn't even remember after a short time. But what happened was that every conflict created the justification for the next conflict. Because there were just an increasing number of injuries. And so there was always justification for keeping it up. And there became this allegiance to the grudge. It became part of the identity of those families. During the war in the Balkans, I remember hearing in an interview with, and I could never sort out the sides in that thing, but as Yugoslavia was breaking apart, there were Christians on one side and Muslims on the other. And there was an ethnic identity involved. And they were interviewing one of the Christian militiamen. And he was expressing his fervor for killing off as many of these Muslim fighters as possible. And he was going on about, we will never let them quarter their horses in our churches again. And he was talking about it like it had happened earlier in the week. Turns out it happened about 400 years ago. And it was enough to motivate this guy to go to war. And we all remember the horrors of that war. Many were the killing fields. It's also true that, and here comes the cliche of the day, that holding a grudge is like taking poison and expecting the other person to die. And this is where the good mental health part comes in. Holding a grudge has been shown medically to do terrible things to our bodies. It can lead to all sorts of maladies. Cardiovascular problems, digestive problems, and mental problems. It's carrying that grudge. Because see, usually those grudges, unless you turn into this fellow who's out killing Muslims over a 400-year-old insult to the church, most of the time the person against whom the grudge is being held is hardly even conscious of it. So you're not doing any harm to them. Hence the taking poison and expecting the other person to die. It hurts us. It affects our mental health. It shuts our hearts down. And I don't mean physically, though eventually that could happen. We become hard-hearted. So much so that it becomes part of our identity. We carry grudges sometimes for almost out of kind of a strange sense of honoring a person that was injured. What Jesus is telling Peter is you just have to keep forgiving. And too often we think that forgiving is, you know how somebody will say, I'm really sorry about that. And we say, oh, that's okay. Well, often it's not okay. It's not okay. It's not okay that somebody did something to you. I mean, if it was inadvertent, if it was accidental, that's one thing. But if someone intentionally does harm, that's not okay. But if we keep hanging on to this grudge, it's not an acknowledgement that something that's not okay is okay. That's a lie. But if we hold on to that, it's letting go of the charge, letting go of that grip, the power that it has over us to control our emotions, to control our actions, to control our thoughts, that can just take us over. We become driven by this grudge. And what Jesus is inviting us to do is, in the knowledge of how easy, how difficult, not easy, how difficult it is. How many times, Peter says? 7. 7? To forgive? It means it didn't take the first 6. What happens if somebody comes up to punch you in the arm? You remember, you were all in school. You tighten up to take the blow. Blow comes, you've got a bruised arm. But anyone in martial arts knows that you deflect. You push it aside. You take that energy and just direct it elsewhere. When we live more, don't hold on to grudge, we forgive, and we move on. And if the person comes back 77 times, we just keep redirecting and sending them away. It seems to me that these sorts of teachings that Jesus offers